The term toxic masculinity is a phrase that is constantly used, misused, and evolving alongside societal norms and culture. Estoque asked Monta Vista High School seniors William Liou and Nathan Lee and English teacher David Clarke their perspectives on the term.
So toxic masculinity is when the standards of masculinity get really concentrated, leading to a lot of pressure to be violent, to be angry in order to be considered like a real man.
It's just like being pressured to do things that's like not really like who you are, but just being pressured because everyone else is a lot of other guys are doing it, and it's more like manly, and therefore you're required to do it.
The way it's really become to be used more is not only the effect on males, but also the effect on that sort of toxic version of identity upon other people as well, and it seems to be it's moving more in that direction, although it still has that sort of component of the damage it does to the people who have that identity.
When you're a freshman in the weight room, like everyone is out here like lifting big weights, right? When they're benching big weights, and then especially like when you're in there with a lot of the football guys, and then you're just kind of in there and you kind of feel embarrassed not being able to lift as much as everyone else. So
I saw one passing tip on Reddit, which is like a great source, about how you have to like push people out of the way if you want to be considered a real man, because otherwise people are not going to see you as a man, which I think is really harmful. And like luckily I was thinking about it as I was reading these tips, and I was like, that doesn't sound like something that, that doesn't sound like the kind of man that I want to be. So I've seen the pressure, but I don't feel like I've experienced it.
I have secondary sort of like experiences with toxic masculinity in seeing it in other people and in seeing people who are even males who are affected by that expectation, but I never felt like I had any sort of expectations imposed upon me as a male that I felt were destructive either to me or to anybody else. And a lot of that is just where I grew up, and a lot of that is being upper middle class and white and highly educated, and so that's not the culture I came from.
like a lot of people talk about how like, oh, models like have like really good looks and stuff, and a lot of girls are kind of like pressured to kind of look like that, but the same thing happens with guys as well. Like a lot of male models also have like really nice bodies, and a lot of guys like they have these these quotes where it's like, oh, no pecs, no sex, and stuff like that, and they expect you to have like really good six packs and like really good bodies. So when you don't have that, you also kind of just feel like ashamed of your body as well. Like it's the same thing with guys as it is with girls.
Boys are mocked for crying, boys are mocked for dressing girly or feminine or whatever that means. So they're just kind of, connecting being a man to being violent and angry. And a lot of the times I feel like the military has served as this kind of vehicle for becoming a man that really connects manhood to something horrible, like, literal murder or killing people is now what's considered an initiation rite of masculinity, which is totally messed up.
So I think it's going in two different directions. One is that it's very easy to point it out now, and there is a kind of a way that people can point it out and communicate that, but I think there's also a way for people who engage in behaviors that could be called toxic to sort of communicate with each other and insult other people.
Isn't really a lot of like jock culture or whatever trying to pressure guys to be super masculine and macho, because like a lot of people at the school just aren't that type, They're like, oh, we're gonna, instead of like, oh, let's go, after school, let's play some basketball or whatever, they're like, oh, let's go home and code some website, right? So it's not like, I feel like it's not a culture where being like super strong and buff and like manly is gonna give you more social clout.
I think the culture in Monta Vista is definitely a lot nicer, just because you see a lot more students academically driven rather than driven like physically. So like no one really cares here as much if you're not as fit as someone else. Only you personally care as much because you're so influenced by the social media. when you actually get in the weight room, no one actually judges you for how much you can lift. Everyone's always really helpful, trying to like fix your form and stuff like that. But it's just taking that first step that's the most difficult. And I feel like being in a room full of guys, especially if you're part of that community, it can be a lot more difficult to just get in there.
Particularly, I mean, this is the kind of the flip side of it, I guess, but it's one of the places you really notice it is there's a kind of a toxic femininity too, which is based on a very sort of subordinate, beauty-based, kind of even intellectually inferior sort of thing that kind of happens with women. And you don't see that nearly to the extent that you see that in a lot of high schools. We don't have the kind of dating culture. We don't have the kind of culture which sees women as forming their identity around their relationships with men to the same degree that you see in many schools that I've been at before. So is it better? Yeah, it's better. Is it still exist? Yeah, it still exists, but not nearly to the same extent.
Just trans men in general, they don't realize that, like, as presenting as a man, I have male privilege. So, you know, going from somebody who is assigned female at birth to being male presenting still means that I need to be mindful of women and let them speak about, you know, struggles that they face. Like, obviously, while balancing this with things, with the fact that trans men do face misogyny through, like, reproductive health bans and stuff like that. Yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of underlying misogyny in the trans masculine community that people aren't really recognizing. A lot of the times, online communities do have that kind of pressure to act a certain way, to, you know, talk about your gender a certain way in order to be considered a guy, and with that comes a lot of the toxically masculine traits that people want us to perform to be considered a real man.